Today I thought I'd do a review of the vintage Certina DS PH200 meter watch. I think it's relevant now because the contemporary Certina brand recently announced that they're going to be producing a reissue of this watch. And since I think a lot of people were not really familiar with the original, I thought it'd be good to shed some light on it. But before we get into the present and future, I thought we should start in the past. As far as reputable history producing dive watches, Certina's pretty respectable. Their DS watches, their DS, DS2, DS3 watches in the 60s and 70s have a pretty good track record. The DS2 was used in US Navy Tektite experiments, and the DS3 was an issued watch in the Royal Australian Navy. So they were pretty reliable, reputable tool watches. As far as this particular watch, this was the DS. This came before the DS2 and DS3, according to vintage Certina watches online. This was released initially around 1967, and based on what I see online, I don't think it was produced for very long, and I don't think there are too many surviving examples. Incidentally, the DS stands for double security. I think basically it's a gimmick where they had an elastomer surrounding the movement, or rubber band or elastomer, and it was supposed to give extra shock absorbance to the movement. Now, I say it's a gimmick because no other company, to my knowledge, ever really used something like that, because you'd think if this really gave the movement a big advantage, other manufacturers would start doing it, but instead, no one really ever did. So perhaps it made sense to throw as much stuff as you can into a watch in the 60s and 70s when, for scuba diving, this was possibly, a mission critical kind of tool. But again, I think realistically, it's probably just a gimmick. Incidentally, though, when I got this watch, it was missing that elastomer, and I had to talk to someone who could fit a replacement in. So it's sort of a pain if it's missing, because you're just going to have this gap surrounding the movement. But anyway, this was again released around 1967, and this, as you can tell, is a traditional normal watch case. Certina's DS2 and DS3s are much larger cushion case designs, so if you happen to be interested in a vintage watch with sword hands that has a traditional watch case outside of Rolex Milsub and maybe Omega Seamaster 300, this is one of your few options. But I'll get to more of that later. As far as the watch itself, let's start with the bezel. Bezel is acrylic and it has a crack here, which is not uncommon, and scuffing. And that's probably in part why they stopped manufacturing acrylic bezel inserts. But it's still pretty cool looking, and because of the crack, I prefer not to turn it, just in case. Though sometimes you see people, I guess, presumably the bezel insert falls out, they use some sort of other replacement, and that sort of really takes away from the look of the watch. At least Gerard Perregaux used the same bezel and possibly case in one of their dive watches of the same vintage. But for the most part, you can't call this real cookie cutter watch compared to some other watches of that vintage. And then we go to the dial and the handset, and obviously this watch's main claim to fame is the sword hand set, which, as I said, of that time period, the Rolex Milsub and Omega Seamaster are really the only ones that had those handsets. And this one has aged pretty well. The minute hand looks a bit funky, and I'm assuming there was probably some sort of water ingress, because obviously the hour hand matches the dial markers, but the minute hand is off. It doesn't bother me too much. Again, I mean, the reality is this watch has seen a lot of use, and it's to be expected. Outside of that, you'll notice the date wheel, it appears to be silvery metallic, which is a really interesting little feature. To my knowledge, the only other watch that has that is a contemporary Seiko Marine Master 300. Usually it's going to be like a white background on a date wheel, so I think that's pretty cool. And outside of that, you have the basic functions of the case. You have a signed crown, which is not too common to see, because I guess the crowns got damaged. And you had screwed lugs, which is really neat for a late 60s dive watch. And for people that like fancy cases, this is pretty neat. This has a turtle. The turtle was apparently their little mascot to represent durability and ruggedness. But, if nothing else, even if it was a gimmick, it's still nice looking, if that matters to you. And incidentally, I just want to add that the Certina DS2 and DS3s also use sword hands, but those sword hands were typically painted like orange or white. So if you, again, are interested in a metallic sword hand, this really, as far as Certinas, I believe, is the only option available. And once we go past the dial, we have the movement. And the movement was an in-house Certina 25-651. Now, there's good news and bad news about the movement. The good news is the movement is a workhorse movement. It's pretty rugged and reliable. The bad news is, obviously, contemporary Certina doesn't carry any parts, and if you need to get parts, the silver lining is that it was a ubiquitous movement. The 25-651 was used in a lot of different Certina watches, dress watches, things like that. And those you can buy secondhand very cheap, and you can scavenge the movement, so you can get spare parts through that. So, you know, it's one of the problems when you have a vintage in-house movement is parts are hard to come by, but thankfully this movement was, again, used in lots and lots of watches. And Certina was particularly popular in Scandinavia, so perhaps Scandinavian eBay would be a better choice of stocking up on watches, even though in Europe in general, it's not that difficult to find old Certinas that are very, very cheap. And that's basically the perspective of the vintage Certina. The new one that was released isn't modern Certina's first go-around at doing a reissue. Let me pull up a picture here where we have Certina's original DS3 and the god-awful reissue they released a number of years ago. Those hands they used are absolutely horrible, and a lot of people who bought them ended up having those hands removed and having sword hands put in place. So their first attempt at a reissue was really, really, really bad. This one looks much closer to the mark, and apparently has a low price, though the first thing I notice is that the base of the sword hand is really wide, and it doesn't look right to my eye, because for the most part, if you look at a Rolex Mil Sub, this watch, CWC Royal Navy, or a Omega Seamaster, the sword hand has a really thin base, but for some reason, this base on the reissue is much thicker, and I really find it distracting. That's just me personally, but it's the first thing I notice, and it's really the only thing I notice. I don't know why they didn't use a traditional sword hand, as I think it really would have helped the aesthetic. Outside of that, again, the new one is supposed to be pretty cheap. I don't think initially, or at all, it's supposed to be sold in North America. And interestingly enough, it has technically, at least within the Swatch group, an in-house movement too. Though that movement is a little bit controversial, and I'll leave it to you, the viewer, to research and decide if the pros and cons of that movement as far as long-term serviceability and like third-party abilities to repair are for you. I mean, I'm not really going to be considering getting the new one anyway, so it's sort of a moot point for me, but I did think I should bring that up. So as a summary, again, if you were interested in a quality dive watch from the 60s and 70s that had sword hands, the high end is a Rolex Mil Sub. In the middle, you have an Omega Seamaster 300. And I guess on the bottom, you have the obscure watch that very few people knew, the Certina DS PH200 meters. And I think it's a great watch. It's very wearable every day. Again, like anything with an acrylic bezel, especially if it has damage, you have to be a little bit careful. But outside of that, I think it's perfectly wearable. And even if people aren't going to seek out vintage Certinas or anything like that, I hope the release of this new Certina will at least get more people to research Certina's really rich and interesting dive watch history, because it really is something that is worthwhile if you happen to be collecting, especially vintage dive watches. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.